Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, St. Norbert College Professor of History, Dr. Robert Kramer. Robert Kramer has been a member of this college for 36 years, teaching courses on the history of the Middle East and Africa. Dr. Kramer earned his doctorate in African history from Northwestern University, MA in Middle East Studies from the University of Chicago, and a bachelor's degree from Bard College. Additionally, he has studied Arabic at the American University in Cairo, served as a Fulbright scholar in Sudan, conducted research in London, Sudan, and Ghana, and authored numerous publications. Dr. Kramer has received many awards and recognitions during his tenure at the Noble College, including Leonard Levina Award for Excellence in Teaching, the Donald B. King Distinguished Scholar Award, the Rembert Wickland Community Service Award, and the Thomas A. Mannion Award for Internationalization. He is a specialist on Sudan and the Nile River Valley with an emphasis on state formation and Islamic movements. His recent research and writing has been on the modern history of Palestine. Dr. Kramer is also committed to speaking about the Middle East and the Islamic world. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Dr. Robert Kramer.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Father Onwu. I'm not sure where to stand. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah? You can hear me? Good. Please tell me if I'm not coming through because I want to make sure that I am heard. Okay. So this seems to be good. You can hear me in the back there? Yeah? Great. Okay, thank you. A little louder. Okay, maybe I should lean in. Okay. Good. I'll do that. Well, thank you very much, Father Onwu. I was just talking to some people and telling them this is kind of an poignant event for me because 36 years ago, the very first public talk I gave at St. Norbert College was on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And now here we are 36 years later, speaking about the same thing. Of course, things have changed enormously since then. Well, good evening. Thank you all for attending this event, which I am both happy and sad to say will be my last public lecture at St. Norbert College after 36 years. It has been a wonderful and fulfilling career, and I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to teach such excellent students and be among such talented scholars and teachers as my own colleagues. Tonight's topic, similar to others in this lecture series, focuses on American policy. And the briefing book that accompanies this lecture was prepared by a renowned scholar of international affairs. Foreign policy experts tend to analyze strategic, economic, and political tendencies, and with an eye on the historical background, propose a way forward for U.S. policy. Historians tend to look at things differently. We focus exclusively on the past, on how things came to be the way they are today. And then we suggest what might be possible in the short-term future. We are notoriously reluctant to predict events, mindful of the fact that conditions are constantly changing, nor are we inclined to seek lessons from the past that might exactly apply to the present for the very same reason. In a general way, however, perhaps there are some lessons, or at least some truths, that we might consider when thinking about American involvement in the Middle East. But as I said, things are constantly changing. And one profound change, something that sets current U.S. policy apart from all previous eras, is this: that we are now governed by a president who views every interaction as transactional, who disdains expert opinion and is willfully ignorant of history, who openly admires and courts the admiration of authoritarian rulers throughout the world, who demands the personal loyalty of his cabinet ministers and judges and agency directors, who rejects the very notion of legal oversight, and who has cultivated a very close personal relationship with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who, like Mr. Trump, is under indictment for serious crimes. Unlike Mr. Trump, Mr. Netanyahu has not yet been convicted, since he is immune while he is in office. In other words, we cannot be sure if the foreign policies of the United States will henceforth be policies, as in the past, crafted by seasoned analysts and diplomats, or policies that serve the whim and inflate the ego of an insecure narcissist. I would add, and enrich the wallet. Thus, an important caveat as we begin. While we might come to some understanding of the problems that afflict the Middle East and that challenge U.S. foreign policy, we cannot assume that the international agreements and multilateral diplomatic thinking that have prevailed since the end of the Second World War are still relevant today. We are in very new territory. Before I get into Gaza, and I trust that's a topic that we will be exploring in more detail in the question and answer session, I'd like to talk a little bit about talking about the Middle East. The map up here, it's the only image I'll be using. People who are observant will notice it's not exactly up to date. There's something wrong. Can anyone point out what's wrong with the map? Right, but there's still no Palestine. Yeah. No, yes, the Sudan is shown as one country. In 2011, Sudan split. The South seceded. So in fact, the Sudan is now the Republic of South Sudan and the Republic of North Sudan. That's the one obvious difference I can see. And being a Sudanist, of course, that's what I would notice. But we will get to Palestine, of course. The map shows us an image of what is called the Middle East and North Africa. And the region that I'm going to refer to specifically as Middle East is the Arabian Peninsula, Iran, Turkey, and Egypt. That would be, of course, there's the Arabian Peninsula, Iran, Turkey, all of that territory, more or less the heartland of the Middle East as we consider it. What the map does not reveal is the tremendous geographic and environmental diversity that creates microclimate zones, sometimes in a very small area, and consequently determines a great deal about where people live and how they live there. In the same way, the vast desert areas that dominate the northern portions of Africa, the interior of Arabia, and much of Turkey and Iran do not necessarily represent a barrier to movement or trade or communication, since these areas are crisscrossed by numerous routes that have been traversed since ancient times. Something else, often overlooked, is the tremendous ethnic and religious diversity of the region, and especially in what used to be called the Levant, which is the eastern Mediterranean coast from Syria to Palestine, including what is today Israel, but applying as well to Iraq, Iran, and other places. For example, to divide the peoples of the Middle East into basic ethnic or linguistic categories, Arabs, Persians, and Turks, as many people do, ignores the actual multiplicity of ethnic and linguistic groups, as well as the innumerable ways in which people identify themselves. For instance, one can easily find maps on the internet that identify the religions of the Middle East as Muslim, Christian, and Jewish. The latter, of course, almost exclusively in Israel. But these maps rarely describe the variety of Christian denominations: Greek Orthodox, Greek Catholic, Roman Catholic, Syriac Orthodox, Syriac Catholic, Armenian Orthodox, Armenian Catholic, Coptic, Lutheran, Anglican, and others. Nor do these maps break down the category Muslim into Sunni, Shiite, Nusayri, Ismaili, Alawite, and others. And then there are the Druze, the Kurds, the Yazidis, Assyrians, Mandeans, Baha'is, Chaldeans, Zoroastrians, and others. Ethnic, linguistic, and other religious communities which are separate unto themselves. Again, the point, this is a place of tremendous geographic, environmental, ethnic, linguistic diversity. All of this is to remind ourselves that any discussion of something as vast and complex as what we call the Middle East is bound to be a huge generalization. And every assertion we make is only accurate or true, more or less. Now, let me begin with what I'm calling quality of life issues in the Middle East. Poverty, illiteracy, healthcare, women's rights, including women's access to education and participation in the marketplace and public service. One can find ample statistics that shed light on these issues. However, statistics are often subject to manipulation. Surprise, surprise. And in the best of conditions, statistics are only as good as the skill of those collecting the data. Moreover, statistics do not and cannot reveal the extent of any problem, or the way it varies within any country, or varies seasonally, or among ethnic and religious communities, or between socioeconomic groups, or from urban areas to rural areas. Nor in the wealthy Persian Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the rest, United Arab Emirates, do the gatherers of data bother to include the guest worker population, who are mainly immigrant workers from India, the Philippines, Nepal, and East Africa. People who vastly outnumber the native-born subjects. And these people are almost never considered in computing such things as literacy, female literacy, access to education, access to healthcare, etc. Okay, those are all my caveats. All that said, literacy in the Middle East is generally very high, which is surprising. People expect to hear that it's extremely low. As of 2022, Palestinian adults were said to be almost 98% literate. Saudi Arabians, over 99% literate. Subjects of the United Arab Emirates, 98% literate. Likewise, both Iran and Turkey claim adult literacy rates well above 90%. Egypt, meanwhile, is closer to 75% adult literacy, while Iraq is believed to be 86% and Yemen around 55%. Literacy rates for women are, as a rule, lower than those for men, although Jordan claims that 98% of adult women are literate as of 2020, as do most of the wealthy Persian Gulf nations. This may well be the case. These countries boast numerous all-female universities. For comparison, by the way, thinking about literacy rates in the 90s, as of 2024, 79% of American adults, on average, are literate, compared to, say, 98% of Palestinians or Saudis or Iranians, Turks. As of 2024, 79% of U.S. adults, on average, are literate. However, 54% of American adults have a literacy rate below the 6th grade level. 20% of American adults have a literacy rate below the 5th grade level. Sobering fact. However, looking at the literacy rates raises some important questions in the Middle East, which go well beyond the numbers themselves. How well do people read? What do they read? What materials or information are they exposed to or have access to? What is the quality of the education they receive? Are they able to think critically about what they are exposed to, or has their education ignored critical thinking in favor of memorization? An inescapable fact is that for most of the Middle East and North Africa, critical thinking, which practically speaking is necessary for responsible economic and political choices, is generally passed over in favor of the acquisition of marketable skills. Business and engineering, say, instead of philosophy or history. And so while we may be satisfied with the reported overall high literacy rates in the Middle East, we are left with some serious questions about what exactly that means. The same situation applies to other quality of life issues. Access to health care, for instance. It is sufficient to say that as a rule, healthcare facilities are amply available for some, not very available to others, and in some cases, entirely unavailable. For example, Saudi Arabians and Qataris enjoy excellent medical care. Egyptians, Lebanese, and Iraqis, not so much, and entirely related to their location and their socioeconomic status. As for the Palestinian people, that is another matter entirely. All of these issues, literacy, women's education, women's involvement in the economy, adequate health care, etc., present enormous obstacles to attaining and maintaining a strong economy, a healthy population, and an effective citizenry, which in turn are the underpinnings of a stable society, which in turn is absolutely in the best interests of the United States. Since the end of the Second World War, the U.S. has been a major source, sometimes the major source, of funding to promote the social and economic development of many Middle Eastern nations. And foreign aid, of course, is a key tool of diplomacy, which advances American interests politically, economically, and strategically. However, as I said earlier, we are in new territory. Thus, it is more than a little worrisome to read in this week's news that Elon Musk's Department of Governmental Efficiency, or DOGE, has been given permission by President Trump to place under administrative leave the staff of the U.S. Agency for International Development, or AID, which is the organization that distributes American aid abroad. On Monday, DOGE took over access to AID's security systems and personnel files, including classified information. And on Tuesday, it was reported that AID is going to be transformed from an independent operation whose programs are designed by in-country field workers who know the local needs to an appendage of the U.S. State Department under the direction of a political appointee. Thus, the future effectiveness of the agency that dispenses billions of dollars annually to alleviate poverty, treat diseases, and respond to famines and natural disasters must be considered in serious doubt. And with it, America's influence in the region. In addition to quality of life issues and questions related to American foreign aid, we must also consider an issue that transcends politics, and indeed transcends everything else, which is climate change. Already, we can clearly measure the effects of climate change in the Middle East in vastly reduced rainfall, aberrant rainfall patterns, and subsequent poor agricultural yields. It was climate change, in fact, and the migration from rural to urban areas that it caused that contributed to the horrific Syrian civil war, which, beginning in 2011, has only recently come to an end, or so we hope, with the overthrow of the Assad regime that had ruled Syria for some 50 years. Likewise, climate change is responsible for the decades-long, almost inestimable flow of people from sub-Saharan Africa and parts of the Middle East to the Mediterranean shores, hoping for refuge in a Europe that is quickly closing its doors to immigrants. Most climate change studies suggest that North Africa and the Middle East will be among the most affected portions of the world in the decades to come. What this bodes for food supply and hence political stability of the region does not require much imagination. An added concern for Egypt is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, constructed on the Blue Nile to provide hydroelectric power to Ethiopia, which will certainly reduce Egypt's share of the Nile water and hence have a direct negative effect on Egypt's agricultural yields. This should be of great concern to the United States, since Egypt, along with Israel, is America's most important ally in the Middle East and boasts the largest population in the region. Now, regarding the Middle East after Gaza, and I think you can tell from my earlier remarks how enormous a subject that actually is, there are many localized situations that we could discuss, and perhaps that will happen during the question and answer session. I'm thinking specifically about Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran. But of course, there are important concerns about every country in the Middle East. Clearly, however, the most intractable issue is the conflict between the Israeli and Palestinian peoples. Intractable because it embodies not just problems of a political nature, that is, two nations fighting over the same territory, or of a wider diplomatic nature, that is connected to America's relations with the rest of the Middle East, or even of a broader geopolitical nature involving China and Russia, but also this. This is an issue, a problem of a religious and ideological nature, a matter of belief, in which all three monotheistic religions have played and continue to play a role. Thus, from the outset, any discussion of the Israel-Palestine conflict must begin with this question: is this a conflict whose resolution is subject to reason? Let me offer some thoughts on the matter. First, there's so much to say. Of course, in writing this, I had no idea where to begin, I have to admit. I had to take a giant step back and say, okay, where does one begin with this? So I thought about my students, many of whom are here today, and how I would speak to them. First, this is not an ancient enmity, despite how many times news outlets and popular authors refer to it that way. It is not a conflict from time immemorial or anything like this. The problem really begins in the early 20th century, just prior to the First World War, when newly arriving Jews, fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe, decided that the building up of their ancient homeland required the creation of an exclusively Hebrew-speaking administrative apparatus, while all the land they had purchased from absentee landlords should be cultivated by Jews exclusively as an exercise in the building up of the people. This was in sharp contrast to the ways the religious communities had interacted in Palestine during the many centuries of Ottoman Turkish rule. What followed was the alienation of the Palestinian people from their own lands, in increments, amidst a rapidly heating up real estate market. This was happening at a time when nationalism was one of the dominant ideas of the time. And emerging nationalist movements could be found throughout Europe and the Middle East. Thus, it did not take long for Zionism or Jewish nationalism to face stiff opposition from a newly born Palestinian nationalism. So, point number one, it is not an ancient conflict. It's about 100 years old. Secondly, the conflict did not begin as an exclusively religious issue, although it has been spoken of that way by extremists on both sides. For every Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam, the Muslim preacher who led in opposition to British and Jewish control over Palestinian lands, he died in 1935, and for every Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, a chief rabbi of Palestine and a proponent of Messianic Zionism, who also died in 1935, there were a great many others for whom the problem was entirely political and economic. Certainly the generation that founded Israel in the first half of the 20th century were, by and large, secular Jews who envisioned a progressive and collectivist society existing harmoniously with its Arab neighbors. The Palestine Liberation Organization, meanwhile, established in 1964, or PLO, was from the beginning a secular Palestinian movement with close ideological ties to other Arab nationalist movements. All that said, the issue has become more religious. As time has elapsed, conditions have worsened, hopes have been crushed, desperation and frustration have mounted, and external players and events have influenced the conflict. Chief among these external events and players are the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and the subsequent rapid development of various forms of militant Islam or Islamism in the Middle East and elsewhere. Parallel to this, we see the growth of the Jewish West Bank settler movement following the 1967 Arab-Israeli War and the rise and expansion of something new, religious Zionism, not secular, but religious Zionism, which regards all of the territory between the Jordan River, the boundary of Israel and Jordan, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea as Eretz Yisrael, or the land of Israel. Both of these can be considered as absolutist or maximalist positions, the extreme Islamic religious perspective and the extreme Jewish religious perspective. Both can be regarded as absolutist or maximalist positions. Both justify the existence of the other. In fact, depend on the other for validation. And both gain strength from the failure of diplomacy. Thirdly, the great powers, and I intend here the US, Russia, Britain, and France, have done very little since 1948 to effectively resolve this conflict, it must be said. The reasons for this are many. With strategic and economic interests at the forefront, I do not think it is cynical to suggest that the continuing violence, with all of its attendant horrors, serves the interests of several countries, which seem quite able to ignore the contradiction of providing humanitarian aid to a conflict that they have helped sustain for decades with weapons sales and diplomatic support. Nor should this come as a surprise. Russia, Britain, and France first became involved in the Middle East back in the 18th century, and they deepened their involvement in the 19th century of imperialism, while the US became a player in the Middle East after the Second World War. If the UN partition of Palestine in 1947, which divided Palestine into a Jewish country and an Arab country, if the UN partition of Palestine in 1947, which was a watershed event, was to have had any chance to survive or succeed, if the notion of two independent states or one binational state was ever a possibility, this needed to be implemented and maintained by UN forces on the ground. But of course, that was never a possibility. Great Britain in particular was only too eager to wash their hands of the whole mess. Thus, I have little to no hope of a realistic diplomatic solution being proposed by any external power, including the United States or Saudi Arabia or any other country. Finally, the obliteration of Gaza by Israel during the last 15 plus months has changed the situation entirely. In retrospect, one wonders if Hamas had any inkling of how Israel would respond to the massacres and kidnappings of October 7, if they realistically thought that they could win, and what winning would look like. One also cannot help but wonder if the events of October 7 haven't played precisely into the hands of Israeli expansionists, who have long sought to drive the Palestinians out of Gaza, and the West Bank for that matter, in order to erase any possible idea of a Palestinian state and to create a greater land of Israel. The Israelis and the Palestinians are at an existential crossroads. Forcibly removing 2 million Palestinians from Gaza, as both Mr. Trump and Mr. Netanyahu seem inclined to do. Yes, I know today they walked it back. Forcibly removing 2 million Palestinians from Gaza and foisting them upon Egypt and Jordan, both of whom are unwilling and unable to accept refugees, cannot and will not lead to anything but increased violence. The destabilization of both countries, Egypt and Jordan, and the further erosion of America's reputation in the region. And yet, Gaza is all but uninhabitable. The West Bank cannot contain them, not without a complete Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank, which will not happen. Meanwhile, the idea of Israel annexing the West Bank and including it into Israel is already being openly discussed in the Israeli media. It is, in my view, all but a fait accompli. The extremists on both sides have won the day. It remains to be seen just exactly what they have won. Thank you. Now, I tried to time my remarks to a half an hour, and I think I'm pretty much on the button because I wanted to allow as much time as possible for questions and discussion.
It is time for Q&A. We have a microphone here and somewhere there. So what I will ask you to do, just say your name, be very brief in your question, and if you raise up your hand first, someone will come to you for before you speak. Okay.
First question is always the hardest.
Thank you, Father Onmu and Dr. Kramer, for hosting the event. Nick Woroff, I took your Islamist class a couple years ago and as an audit. To minimize bloodshed, is it a situation where you have to kind of let the bully, being Trump, because he's a bully, and Netanyahu, just concede to them, and even though it doesn't feel good, you end up saving more lives in the process?
Well, it depends who's making that decision. As best I can understand, very few of the 2 million Palestinians in Gaza want to leave. And from the people, the Gaza people that I know and have gotten to know, they've made it adamantly clear that they're staying, even if their home, as most homes are, is rubble. Something like 90% of the housing stock of Gaza was destroyed. Some 90% of the population of 2.1 million people are homeless. And yet they are insisting they will pitch a tent and they will wait for the site to be cleared and they'll rebuild. They are not going to leave. And the reason for that is that a lot of the people who are living in Gaza are there as a result of the events of 1948 when Israel was created. An event that, of course, for the Israelis is the War of Independence, what the Palestinians call the Nakba, or the catastrophe. And I think the majority of the population of Gaza are there as refugees from the Nakba, or the catastrophe, where they were forced out of their villages in what became Israel and were crowded into the Gaza Strip and have been there since 1948. So for them to leave, although one can understand how any other option must be better, to them it's the idea that no, we're not going to be displaced twice. We are not going to be made refugees from our own country twice. We will stay even on this miserable strip of beach, and we will not leave and we'll die here. And that goes to something which we were talking about over dinner, a word in Arabic which is used very frequently by Palestinians. It's called sumud. And sumud means resilience, not giving up. No matter what, even if I have to die in this spot, I'm not leaving. And that is ingrained in most people that I know, most Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. So I do understand that looking at the photographs, I mean, it's nightmarish. There are no facilities of any sort, no buildings, nothing left. And yet there's a principle at stake that I think transcends people's well-being. People with the microphones.
Dr. Kramer, I think that what should happen is Donald Trump should move all the Palestinians to Mar-a-Lago. I know that's just a joke, but do you, he's making these illusions about boots on the ground, I mean, in your opinion, do you think we would have U.S. troops in there, into Gaza at any given time in the future?
I don't. I don't think so.
Oh, that's great.
I mean, don't forget, Mr. Trump, when he was elected the first time, ran on this program of opposing American military involvement in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and elsewhere, wanting to pull back our involvement, which he saw as an overreach and saw as an economic drain and as a burden to the country. So it would be quite a contradiction if he suggested sending American troops to Palestine. I don't think it's feasible. And I have a colleague who says that from a purely economic point of view, it would never happen, the amount of money it would cost. But one never knows. I mean, he's a hard man to read, put it that way. Question in the back? There's lots of questions.
Good evening. Something that I don't think was mentioned in the presentation, but is still a very massive issue that's honestly brushed over in favor of talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict is the Sudanese civil war right now, where there's another massive refugee crisis, a lot of bloodshed down there. I haven't heard a lot about it, so I was just wondering what your thoughts on it were.
Well, thank you for asking the question. The Sudan, you're absolutely right, 100%. The Sudan is an issue that has been ignored by most of the press. I think the only publication that regularly reports on the Sudan is the British newspaper, The Guardian. And being a Sudanist, that is the area of my specialty. I lived for almost 2 years in Khartoum, the capital. I don't know what to say. The Sudan split into North Sudan and South Sudan in 2011. It pretty much split right in half. And that was supposed to bring an era of peace and goodwill between the two halves. There was conflict immediately because there's oil right in the middle of where the two countries come together, and both sides are claiming that oil. But the only way to get the oil out of the country is to export it by pipeline to the Red Sea. And of course, that goes directly through the northern Sudan. So there's been a lot of fighting between the North and the South since 2011 over who controls or has access or could benefit from the oil. But your question really is with regard to the northern Sudan. There's been a civil war going on since 2023. Two northern Sudanese armies are fighting each other, and they have essentially laid waste to the country. Almost every remnant of the country that was born in 1956 has been destroyed. They've destroyed the capital area, the three-city capital of Khartoum, Khartoum North and Omdurman. They've destroyed residential neighborhoods, commercial, real estate, government offices. They've ransacked all of the universities and libraries. They've ransacked the two national museums, one of which had, of course, enormously important exhibits and remains from the pyramids of the northern Sudan, of the region of Nubia. Some of the most important antiquities of the ancient Nilotic world were there, and these have been entirely looted, defaced, burned. I mean, it is appalling. One doesn't even know what words to use. It is an outbreak of just sheer barbarism and anarchy. Most of the Sudanese that I know and have stayed in touch with since the 80s are out of the country. They are in either the Emirates or in Egypt or somewhere else. Those who can't leave the country have gone to the northern part of the Sudan, closer to the Egyptian border, seeking refuge. But it is a horrendous situation, and it, of course, deserves its own at-length talk. The carnage, the violence, the weaponization of rape, the destruction of knowledge, the effacing of the entire historical heritage of the Sudan in its archives and libraries is, again, there are no words. And for someone like myself as a Sudanist, one doesn't even know what to say. It's just the worst thing possible. And the Sudanese people are suffering just more terribly than one can imagine, unfortunately.
I am reminded of American foreign policy vis-a-vis Iran, displacing a nascent democracy in 1955, I want to say. Three opportunities that the people of Iran have given to the world by uprisings against one of the most despotic and radical regimes in the Middle East, the Islamic Republic of Iran. In 1999, in 2009, the Green Movement and the Women Life Freedom Movement, and governments that are probably much more to your sensibility, have sided with oppressive forces rather than siding with democracy movements. They continuous throwing of a lifeline to the Islamic regime by nuclear agreements that were unreliable, unproductive, but gave resources to a government that is profoundly anti-Semitic, who used those resources to bring supply arms to the Hezbollah, Hamas, this involvement in Syria, holding the Assad regime up, the Houthis in okay, that those are the consequences of actions taken by governments that you would be very endorsing of.
Well, thank you very much for that comment. I don't know which movements you're referring to that you think I would be in favor of. If you think I'm a supporter of Hamas or Islamic Jihad, no. Obviously, I find the regime in Iran abhorrent and appalling. But there's a lot that is abhorrent and appalling in the Middle East.
I was just wondering about, more to your opinion, if you think a two-state solution is even feasible at this point, and if so, what is that going to take? How would that play out?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. The United States has been advocating a two-state solution for a very long time. And of course, that was the intention of the United Nations in the partition of Palestine in November of 1947. But as I said earlier, it was never put into effect. And it was, in my view, handled in an abysmal and irresponsible way, and maybe deliberately so. Nonetheless, your question is a two-state solution still a viable idea? I'm torn. I don't know. Part of me says it's hopeless. And most days I wake up and I feel like it's hopeless. I don't want to go through a whole PowerPoint presentation, and those of you who are students of mine know that I'm terrible with technology. If I touch the computer, something's going to go wrong, right? But if you can imagine what the West Bank looks like, it's kind of a kidney shape carved out of the eastern side of Israel. And it's all that's remaining of Palestine, except for Gaza. This West Bank has been slowly and consistently gobbled up by Israel. As a result of the 93 and 95 Oslo Accords, some 2/3 of the West Bank is under direct Israeli control. And even the part of the West Bank that's supposed to be what they call Area A, under direct Palestinian military and civil control, that is security control and civil control. This would be the major Palestinian cities: Jenin, Nablus, Ramallah, Bethlehem, places like this, where there's a concentrated Palestinian population. Even in Area A, the Israeli Defense Force, IDF, comes in all the time, unchallenged and unquestioned. So their control over the West Bank is absolutely an iron firm grasp. And the settler movement has proliferated to such an extent that what in the 1970s and 80s was regarded as aberrant thinking among extremist Jews who are advocating settling in the West Bank, which is going to disrupt the whole peace process, that's now become mainstream. And I think it is a mainstream idea in Israel now that the West Bank is not the West Bank. In fact, many Israelis will say there's no such thing as the West Bank. It doesn't exist. It's all the land of Israel, and we refer to it by its biblical names, Judea and Samaria. And a lot of Israeli maps, of course, will refer to the West Bank as Judea and Samaria. So, given the fact that there are as many Jewish settlements, Israeli Jewish settlements in the West Bank, and again, if I were to show you a map, they are absolutely throughout the West Bank. Given the infrastructure, the roads that have been built, connecting these settlements to Israel proper and Jerusalem, given the political support in Israel for the continuation and expansion of the settler movement, I find it very hard to hope that there is still a possibility for a two-state solution. On the other hand, talking to Israeli friends and Palestinian friends who advocate for peace always remind me, Robert, don't give up hope. There's always hope. And the younger generation, I would say people your age, who are growing up in a different world, and in particular a world that is completely connected by social media, enjoying the same music, talking to one another by WhatsApp, this may move the ball in some ways. The problem is, again, I would say the problem is first and foremost the Israeli electoral system. It's a broken system that has enabled minority governments to rule the state of Israel since its inception in 1948. Put differently, since 1948, when Israel was created, there has never been a majority government in power. Never. Every government since it was created in 1948 has been a coalition. This coalition government gives disproportionate power to the religious parties, who, for religious and ideological reasons, do not want to surrender an inch of what they regard as the land of Israel. So, with what I would call a broken electoral system, it's hard to imagine Israeli government being elected that could make a realistic attempt at implementing a two-state solution. I know that answer is going all over the map, but then again, my thinking on this is like, what do you call that symbol? Infinity, right, okay, thank you. My feeling on that goes back and forth, and it depends really on the mood and who I'm talking to. Again, a lot of Israelis that I know are very hopeful, but catch them on another day and they're not. I mean, it is a very, very grim and dangerous situation, extremely so. I would have said in the 1960s and 70s, yes, absolutely. But now in 2025, with the Netanyahu government, which is the most right-wing government in Israel's history, I mean, it is made up of members of the settler movement and real political and religious extremists, and with his ally, Mr. Trump, in power in Washington, it's hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel, but I'm hoping to be hopeful, put it that way.
Bob, I've got the mic up here. Robert Pine. I was going to ask you about hope, and you kind of beat me to it there. As I look at the map and hear you talk, I think about something that John Paul Lederach said when he was here, that complexity is our friend. That complexity means there's not just one way forward for which we have to wait, but that in the midst of complexity, it almost doesn't matter where we start. You can start anywhere because everything is needed. And as you think about hopefulness, I was going to ask you what makes you hopeful on the days when you are hopeful, and I'll still give you a chance to answer that. But I'll just note one other bit of hopefulness here, and that is that there's a room full of people who came to hear about it, who care about it, who read about it, that Trump's comments last night caused protest across the world. And protest is always the first phase of hope, where we reject what is present. But I would just like to say, also as a fan and a friend, that your work on this campus has been a legacy of hopefulness, that you're continuing to speak about these things, you're continuing to teach on these things, you're getting up every day and modifying a lesson because something happened in the news overnight is a labor of hopefulness for which we are grateful.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you so much. That is such a kind remark, and I'm so tremendously grateful to be here. One thing that gives me hope is an Israeli Arab woman who's a singer. She's Palestinian, Arab, but she's an Israeli citizen who won the big Israeli song contest. And she's one of the most popular singers in Israel. And she sings in both Arabic and Hebrew. She's the, oh God, help me out. What's her name? Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you. I need to get with the program, I know that. She's the Taylor Swift of Israel and Palestine, and I love the fact that popular music can bring people together. And she's very, very popular. And she says some very edgy things about her identity and that she has a very complicated identity. She is a Palestinian woman, and she's a Muslim, and she is an Arab, and she's an Israeli citizen as well. And she speaks Arabic and she speaks Hebrew. And she refuses to be buttonholed and refuses to be pushed into one corner or another. She said, "This is who I am. Deal with it." I like that. Something else that gives me hope is every time Dr. Pine and I have taken students over the years to Israel and the West Bank for these summer study trips, and we go to the beach in Tel Aviv and we see all of the Israeli Arab Palestinians on the beach with other Israelis enjoying the beach. And something about seeing people frolicking in the water is a very hopeful thing, particularly when children are involved. But again, I'm reaching here to find some hope. I guess in a way, the incredibly small size of the area we're talking about is maybe a hopeful thing too. By way of, oh gosh, I'm not going to have the oh, do I have the image here? No, I don't. Wrong PowerPoint, sorry. The students in my Israel-Palestine class know this image. It's a map of all of Israel, including Gaza and the West Bank, superimposed on a map of Wisconsin, okay? So when we look at a map and we see Israel and we think, oh, gee, I wonder how big that is. The whole thing, Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank, is maybe a third the size of Wisconsin, all right? Maybe a third the size of Wisconsin. It's really small. And in a way, it seems to me that, and again, this is me trying to be hopeful, that what is likely to happen is Israel is going to annex the West Bank. I'm sure they will. They will simply declare it part of Israel. And they will inherit 3 million Palestinian Arabs who are not going to leave because of this notion of resilience or sumud. And Israel will, by default, become a binational state. They may not want it, they may not like it, but there's no alternative. In fact, many people who are in favor of a Jewish state, an exclusively Jewish state, have been imploring Israel since 1967 to cut free Gaza and the West Bank, allow there to be a Palestinian state, because otherwise what you're going to end up with is a hybrid state, which is, I think, in fact, what's going to happen. Something else, historians tend to look at things with the long view, and something I think it's really important to bear in mind is this conflict is only about 100 years old, and this is a blip on the screen of history. This is nothing, nothing at all. This is a part of the world that has been more visited, traveled to, made pilgrimage to, and invaded than any part of the world, and it's still there. So I think Palestine is going to do just fine. I don't know about the people, but I think Palestine's going to be fine, and there will be something. I don't know what it will be, but I don't think it's going to be exclusively this or that. I think something else is going to come into being.
I've got a question. Although realizing the complexity of the issue, the question seems a little bit silly. But knowing that Iran has got a very young population, and realizing that Saudi Arabia wants to deal with Israel, and that this is getting in the way, do we require a regime change in Iran in order to quell Hamas and start to get some rebuilding and maybe some contribution from Saudi Arabia?
Well, I don't know how we would require a regime change in Iran, and that's another subject that I think is going to take us in a different direction. My sense is that the majority of the Iranian people, as best I can tell, are in favor of regime change. But I began the lecture by saying that historians don't believe in lessons of history, but maybe there are some things that we can bear in mind. One thing that I would bear in mind is it is never productive to try to impose regime change on another country, particularly in the Middle East. We've had no success in doing that. Whether there's an American regime that wants to finance and supply an Iranian resistance movement that puts in power a secular democratic regime, well, that would be wonderful. I would be happy for the Iranian people. But I just don't know how we go about doing that. And I think all of the militant talk about flattening Iran and things like that is just, on the one hand, juvenile, and on the other hand, very counterproductive, very unhelpful.
Professor Kramer,
Yes.
could you explain the politics of moving our U.S. embassy? I really never understood that.
Yeah. Well, we have a modern embassy, and it is in Jerusalem. It was moved to Jerusalem. In moving the embassy there, of course, we're making a statement about Jerusalem being, as Israel calls it, the eternal capital of the state of Israel. Now, Jerusalem, that is the old city of Jerusalem, not the Western modern city, is part of the West Bank, actually, as of the 1967 border. So I think making that move was, I would say, kind of a rash, not kind of, was a rash move. But then again, our policies have tended to be much more favorable towards Israel than towards the Palestinian side. That's an unescapable fact. I think the bigger issue really was closing the consulate in Jerusalem that helped and serviced Palestinian people, because we, for a very long time, had an American consulate to which all Palestinians could come and seek visas and help with various things. And in shutting that down, I think that was a big mistake. In the same way, I think shutting down the UN Relief and Works Agency has been a mistake. I understand they claimed that the UN RWA was somehow implicated in the October 7 attack, and there may be some truth to that. But sometimes, again, it's like, cutting off your nose to spite your face. It's just an overreaction. And I think we have tended to do that as a country, unfortunately.
Given our time, we can only entertain two more. Dr. Connor will be the last person.
Thank you. This may be a moot point, but I'm just curious about your perspective. I don't understand how the attack happened. With Israeli security being the best in the world, how could Netanyahu and his cohorts not have known this was going to happen in their backyard? And just because it's blown up to be such a nightmare, I'm just curious about what you think.
Right. Well, there's a couple of explanations. The most widely reported is the young women who were the observers on the border, observing Gaza, watching what was happening for months, had been reporting to the defense establishment that the Gazans are holding exercises in which they're practicing for an assault on the wall. And the wall was not an impenetrable wall, as we all saw from the footage. All you need is a tractor, and basically you go right through it. And then what followed were people on motor scooters and cars and jeeps and trucks and all that stuff. But Israeli women soldiers from the front line, from the border, had been reporting for months something is happening. We're watching this and something is being prepared, and they were ignored. And there will have to be a reckoning with that someday, all right? Okay, so one explanation is that the Israeli defense establishment was asleep at the wheel. They thought that the real threat was coming from the West Bank, that extremists in the West Bank were planning some kind of major attack, and that what was happening in Gaza was just a ploy to distract the Israelis, when in fact that wasn't the case at all. Now that's one explanation. Something else to bear in mind, though. Israel allowed Qatar to funnel billions of dollars into Gaza for years to Hamas. Israel allowed Hamas to be built up to the extent that it is as a counterweight to the more secular and popular and widely acceptable PLO, because they knew the PLO and a secular nationalist movement was going to have more international support for the creation of two states, of a separate Palestinian state. And they thought if maybe the Palestinians are divided between Hamas, which is a very extreme religious movement, and the PLO, which is secular, that they would neutralize each other, they'd cancel each other out. But the fact is, Israel did allow, in the banking system, for Qatar to funnel money to Hamas. And they're going to have to answer for that too. Now, people who believe in conspiracies, and I'm not one of them, but I have heard people say, well, Israel planned this all along. They knew that Hamas was going to do this. They looked the other way. They allowed it to happen. They allowed their own people to be killed just so that they could retaliate in the way they have retaliated and erase Gaza from the map. I don't think so. In the same way, I've heard people say that America allowed 9/11 to happen so they could retaliate against the Muslims. No, I think that's going too far. I think the Israeli defense establishment was asleep at the wheel. I think they were mistaken. And someone will at some point take responsibility, whether it's Netanyahu or not, I don't know. He's managed to avoid prison this long. Maybe he'll continue. I don't know. The woman right here had her hand up for a long time, though.
Millions of Palestinians who are refugees from like the 1967 war, that there's families growing up
Yes.
in camps.
Yes.
So it just seems, how could Jordan then, humanitarian minded, take on any more people? I mean, these people are already in power. There's not enough jobs for them.
Right.
They're living as second-class citizens.
Yeah, it's a good question. Jordan is, you can see, brown country to the east of Israel. Jordan has a huge population of Palestinians who came in 1948 when Israel was created, and then in 1967. The majority of the population in Jordan are Palestinians. They are originally Palestinian. They're now Jordanian citizens. So they are the Palestinian Jordanians, as opposed to those who had lived in Jordan prior to the creation of Israel. For years, for decades, one of Israel's advertising campaigns featured a map of Israel and Jordan, and it said, there already is a Palestinian state. Jordan is Palestine. So in their view, the western half, which is Israel, is the Jewish side of Palestine, and Jordan, which is the most water-poor country in the world, I would add, largely desert, is the Palestinian, is the Arab side of Palestine. So that was the thing. Jordan is Palestine. That was an advertising campaign in the 70s and 80s, mostly 80s. Jordan is Palestine. Didn't convince a lot of people. It had some traction in this country. There are still people who will say, well, the Palestinians have a state. It's Jordan. And that's because, yes, more than 50% of the population are originally from Palestine. But again, the dominant fact is that Jordan already has millions of refugees from Syria and Iraq, in addition to its own population, and is the most water-poor country in the world. So they are in no position to take any refugees.
Hey, Bob.
hi.
Andrew O'Connor.
Hi, Andrew.
Like Bob Pye, I'm a big fan. So earlier you mentioned the rise of religious extremism, like Islamism and religious Zionism. but could you say something briefly about Christian Zionism and
Oh,
how the
yes.
role Christian extremism plays, especially on American policy when it comes to Israel-Palestine?
Wonderful.
Thank
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. O'Connor, one of our professors from theology and religious studies, and an expert on Islam, I might add, a Quran scholar. Yes, a very important question. Zionism, one always associates with the Jewish population because Zionism as a political movement is a Jewish movement, and the movement was to recreate the kingdom of Israel from biblical times in modern-day Palestine. Okay. And that is, of course, its own very involved subject. But before Zionism becomes a popular ideology among Jews, it's an ideology among Christians, which not many people know. And it goes back to the 17th century in England, long before any European Jews in Poland or Russia or Germany or anywhere else are thinking about the idea of moving to Palestine. It begins as a British evangelical Christian movement. And of course, it is a widely popular, or does one say deeply popular, widely and deeply popular idea among American evangelical Christians. The idea is among evangelicals, and it's part of a Christian eschatology, teaching about the end times, about when Jesus will make his parousia, his second coming. And the end times will be ushered in. In that scenario, what's required to bring about the second coming of Jesus and set into motion the end times is the ingathering of the Jewish people and their return to the land of Israel. So this is a crucial idea within evangelical thinking, and it's why the most strong and consistent source of American support for Israel is not the American Jewish community, is not the American Jewish community, which is deeply divided still. The most profound and the strongest and deepest, most consistent source of support are the American evangelical Christians, because for them, Israel is necessary for their vision of the end times, for the second coming of Jesus. So we have, for instance, this man named Clyde Lott in Mississippi. He's a farmer in Mississippi. He's been raising the red heifer. According to passages, I believe, in Leviticus, maybe it's in Numbers, I don't know, I'm thinking it's Leviticus. There's this, all of this discussion about how one can conduct a sacrifice at the temple. So if the temple is rebuilt, which would be the third temple on the site of the second temple, which is on the site of the first temple, on the Temple Mount, presently and inconveniently occupied by the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, but if those two things, the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, should be just whisked away and the third temple built, there would be sacrifices again. And this is all part of the plan to build the temple, renew the sacrifices, and that's going to bring about, set into motion the end times. So this man, Clyde Lott, who is an evangelical Christian in Mississippi, has been breeding the perfect red heifer, because according to the Bible, it has to be a red heifer that is perfectly red in a certain shade of red. I don't know what that shade is. I don't know how you would find or determine or define what that shade is. It's related to a Hebrew word. I don't know on a color wheel what shade of red that is, but he's convinced he understands what that correct shade of red is, and he's going to breed the perfect red heifer. The problem is there cannot be a single white hair. And every time he breeds a red heifer and he thinks he has the right one, lo and behold, a white hair appears. And then it's like, well, it's not the right one. He has already sent, I mean, I know this sounds like you just can't believe this is real, but it is. He's already sent several plane loads of cattle to Egypt, hoping that maybe in the land of Israel, they would breed the right red heifer. So this is a program that is well underway. Again, it goes back to the late 17th century. It really comes into British belief in the 18th century. We get this notion of British Israelism, British people identifying themselves as being part of the tribes of Israel. creating the New Jerusalem in England, on England's green shores. It's a very famous hymn. And we have a bedrock of support in Britain and in the US from evangelical Christians. So yes, it's not something within the Catholic Church nor the Orthodox Church, but it is very much in evangelical Christianity. There have been some very interesting books written about it. Probably the most famous is a book simply called Non-Jewish Zionism, which is a very short, very readable book all about the history and development of Christian Zionism. So again, a little known fact, American Jews were not on board with Israel 100% until the Holocaust. And when the Holocaust became known after World War II, that's when the American Jewish community said, well, okay, now it's a different story. Because now we're thinking about the possibility of the actual annihilation of the entire Jewish people. It now seems like it could happen. Prior to that, most American Jews said, why would I leave here and go there? I like it here, and there's already people there, right? So it's a complicated thing. But again, even today, of course, huge bedrock of Mr. Trump's base, of the MAGA base, are evangelical Christians, as I'm sure you're aware. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Right.
Finally, we have someone from Palestine, and I can't. It's a privilege that we have someone from there who understands all the intricacies of the problem. So I'll give this to.
I'll be quick, promise. Okay, thank you. So I just wanted to say about the October 7th, 2024 thing. You were saying that it was like maybe an attack. It was. But why don't we see it as a defense from Palestine for the 75 years plus of the attack and for the oppression we see as Palestinians from the occupation? Well, maybe it was a stupid move, not really planned, weak, not really funded move from Hamas, but maybe it was like a defense. It wasn't like not just from nothing. Right. It was a defense for the oppression we see as Palestinians from the occupation in Gaza. But it's been like so long until now. Yes. So yeah, it wasn't a question, it was just a comment, and I would like to hear what you say on that.
Thank you very much. Yes, absolutely, 100%. Hilda El-Shawa is one of our students. She's a freshman here at St. Norbert College, and she's from Gaza. Her family only escaped into Egypt in June after their family home had been bombed and flattened by the Israelis. Hilda, you're absolutely right. There's no question about it. When October 7, 2023 happened, I remember most of us talking about it and saying, well, it's not a surprise at all. When you coop 2+ million people in a space as tiny as Gaza, and bear in mind, Gaza was the most densely concentrated place in the world, more so than Bombay and Calcutta and places like this, which are notoriously crowded. The most densely populated place in the world. And when you cram people in there in a really tiny space and blockade them from all sides for decades, well, not quite decades, but a decade and a half, under blockade where very little can come in or go out, it is, as you said earlier, an open-air prison. So what happened on October 7, however strategically unhelpful that probably was in terms of the long-term strategy, was perfectly understandable. It didn't surprise me in the least. In fact, my only wonder at it was how, as someone earlier said, how Israel was taken by surprise. I would have expected that. I mean, they've been kept under pressure, under impossible conditions for a very, very long time. So yes, no, you're right. Whatever it was not irrational. It was a rational decision. Whether it was, again, a poor strategy is another matter, but it was an entirely rational choice to break out and to make a statement that we're not going to live this way anymore.
I would like to thank Dr. Kramer for
There's your answer.
Such a wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you.